There is a valley in the northern corner of Yellowstone where the wind moves through the grass in long, slow waves. It is a wide place, sagebrush and open meadow, hemmed by dark hills, and a river winding through the middle of it, patient and cold. For most of the 20th century, something was missing from that valley. Not a building, not a road. A sound, the sound of wolves. They had been gone for the better part of 70 years, shot and trapped and poisoned, until the last of them fell silent. For a person born in those decades, the wolf was a thing of old photographs and older stories. You could stand in that valley on a winter evening and hear the wind, and the ravens, and the far calls of elk, but you would not hear the one voice the land had known for thousands of years. And then, in the winter of 1995, they came back. Many of you may remember it. Perhaps you saw it on the evening news, on a screen much like this one. Perhaps you remember the debate that came with it, the strong feelings on every side. Tonight, 30 years later, we return to that story. We will not rush it. We will move through it the way the land itself moves, season by season, from one winter to the next. And we will listen quietly for what the rivers remember. It was January of 1995. The ground was hard with frost, and the Lamar Valley lay under snow. Wolves had once been common across the American West. They ranged the mountains and the plains, and they were part of the land as surely as the elk and the rivers. But attitudes were different then. Wolves were seen as a threat to be removed, and the removal was thorough. By the 1920s, a national policy of predator control had done its work. The National Park Service records show that the last wolves in Yellowstone were killed in the 1920s. For decades after, the howl was simply absent. A whole generation of elk and deer grew up without it. Then came a decision, years in the making and argued over at every stage. Under the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service prepared to bring wolves home. It was careful, deliberate work. In January of 1995, 14 wolves were captured in Canada and carried south into the park in crates. A second group arrived in 1996. They were not released at once. To turn them loose immediately might send them running north, all the long way back toward the country they were taken from. So they were held for a time in fenced enclosures, fed and watched, so they might settle. This was called a soft release. And on a cold day that first winter, the gates were opened. For a while, some of the wolves lingered, uncertain. Then, one by one, they stepped out onto Yellowstone snow. After 70 years, the valley had its voice again. Those first weeks were not simple. Some people welcomed the wolves with great feeling, as though something broken had been set right. Others, particularly ranchers whose land bordered the park, worried for their livestock, and their concern was real and long-standing. A wolf does not read a boundary line. To a family whose living depended on cattle or sheep, the return of the predator was not a triumph, but a threat. This was never only a story about animals. It was a story about people, and about how we choose to share a landscape, and about who carries the cost of that sharing. The wolves themselves faced a hard test, a new place, a cold season. Prey they did not yet know, in country they had never walked. Yet the northern range of Yellowstone held one thing in great number: elk. Herds of them, grown large and unhurried over decades without their old predator. The wolves began to hunt. Slowly, carefully, they learned the valley, its ridges and river crossings, and the places where an elk might tire in deep snow. Records from the Yellowstone Wolf Project show that some of those early wolves died, as wild animals do, from injury and from conflict with one another. But others held their ground. They found mates, they dug dens, they raised pups, they formed packs with names that researchers would come to know as well as neighbors. Winter is the season of arrival and of testing. The wolves had arrived. Now the seasons would do the rest. Spring in Yellowstone comes late and comes suddenly. Through April, the snow lingers in the shadows, grey and tired. Then the sun climbs higher, and the change arrives almost overnight. The snow softens and slides from the slopes. The rivers swell with meltwater, running loud and cold and brown. And in the dens hidden along the hillsides, in burrows dug into old terraces above the streams, the first wolf pups were born on American soil in a way they had not been born for generations. For the scientists watching from a respectful distance, this was the true beginning. A single pack that hunts and then fails is only a moment. Pups mean a future. Pups mean the wolves were not merely surviving, but belonging. Over the following springs, the population grew steadily. By the early 2000s, the Yellowstone Wolf Project counted well over 100 wolves inside the park, spread across several packs, each holding its own stretch of country. But the researchers were watching more than wolves. They were watching the elk, and over the years they would come to see the herds change in more than one way. The most lasting change was in their numbers, for over time far fewer elk moved through the northern range than before. Recent studies suggest the elk did not so much abandon their old feeding grounds out of fear. Rather, they kept to many of the same places but shifted the hours at which they fed. And as elk pressure eased along the water, something began to stir at the river's edge, something that had struggled for many long years. The young willows and the aspen and the cottonwood. Green shoots reaching up in places that had been grazed close and bare for as long as anyone could remember. This is the part of the story that traveled the furthest. It became the version told in classrooms and in short films the world over, and it is easy to see why, because it is beautiful, and because it seems to promise that one good act can heal a whole broken place. Scientists use a phrase for the idea behind it. They call it a trophic cascade. The idea is simple to say, though harder to prove. When you return a top predator, its effects may ripple downward through the whole web of life, one level touching the next. Wolves press the elk grow fewer, and those that remain feed differently. The young trees, no longer nibbled to the ground each season, grow tall at last, and with the trees come other changes. Beavers, which need willow to eat and to build with, found more to work with along the banks. Researchers noted a rise in beaver colonies along parts of the northern range. This matters more than it might sound. Beaver dams slow the water. Slowed water spreads out, sideways, into pools and wet meadows and side channels. Songbirds return to the thickets. Frogs and insects find still water. Fish find cool, shaded pools beneath the overhanging green. One small engineer, and the whole valley grows wetter and richer. Some studies, including work by the researchers Ripple and Beshta, published in 2012, described willows and aspen recovering in places where elk pressure had eased. It became a beloved story, told again and again, sometimes as though the wolves had single-handedly turned the rivers a different way, as though they had reached down and moved the water with their own paws. But here we must slow down and speak honestly, because the full truth is more careful than the popular version, and the careful truth is, in its own way, more interesting. Not all scientists agree on how much the wolves alone accomplished. This is not a quarrel to be embarrassed by. It is how good science works, patiently, with measurement and doubt. Later studies, including work drawing on US Geological Survey research, suggested that the recovery was uneven across the park. In some stream valleys, the willows returned strongly, tall and thick along the banks. In others, they did not. There the ground had dried, or the streams had cut too deep. During the years the beavers were gone, running low between steep banks, where willow roots could no longer reach the water. The damage of those absent decades did not simply undo itself. And the elk numbers fell for more than one reason, and that fall in numbers did much of the work of easing the pressure on the young trees. Wolves played a part, certainly, but so did grizzly and black bears taking calves in spring and mountain lions in the high country, and hard winters that starved the weak, and years of drought, and the choices of human hunters outside the park boundary. Nature rarely moves by a single cause. It moves by many causes, braided together like the channels of a river, so that no one strand can be pulled loose and named the whole. So when we say the wolves changed the rivers, we should say it gently. The honest version is this: the return of the wolves was part of a larger recovery, one thread in a wide and complicated weave, working alongside weather and other animals and time itself. That does not make it a smaller story. It makes it a truer one. The land is not a machine with one lever to pull. It is a living thing, and living things answer slowly and in their own way, and not always the way we hoped. By autumn, the valley glows. The grasses turn gold, and the cottonwoods along the water burn a soft yellow before they fall, and the mornings carry the first real bite of cold. Autumn is a season for looking back, for taking stock before the snow returns, and 30 years is time enough to look. In that span, Yellowstone's wolves have become among the most studied wild animals anywhere on Earth. Researchers have followed generations of them, learning their families and their rivalries, their long journeys across the park, the births of their pups, and in time, their deaths. They have watched packs rise and fall, split and reform. Grey wolves recovered across parts of the northern Rocky Mountains, enough that management of the species passed over the years through many legal and political changes, from federal protection and back again, argued in courtrooms and legislatures. Visitors began to come simply to watch. In the early mornings, before the light is full, people gather along the Lamar Valley Road with spotting scopes and thermoses of coffee, their breath clouding in the cold, hoping for a distant grey shape moving through the sage. Strangers share a scope and speak in low voices. A whole quiet culture grew around that waiting, patient and kind. And for those who study the land, autumn brings the counting. The willows measured against last year, the beaver dams mapped along the streams, the elk herds tallied from the air and the ground. Year after year, the patient, unglamorous work of watching and writing down and watching again. It is not a story that ended. It is a story that is still being written, one season at a time, and so we come back to winter, where we began. The snow returns to the Lamar Valley, soft and deep, smoothing the land to a single pale sweep. The wolves, descendants now of those first 14 and their kin, move through it as though they had never been gone. A pack crosses a frozen meadow in single file, dark against the white, unhurried at home. To stand there on a still morning, hearing a howl rise and answer from across the valley, you would not guess that the sound of them once fell silent for 70 years. We often imagine that when something is lost from a place, it is lost forever, that the land forgets, and that what is broken cannot be mended. Many of us have felt that quiet grief, watching familiar things disappear across a lifetime. But Yellowstone suggests otherwise. Given time and given care, and given the humility to let nature take its own uneven course, a valley can begin to mend. Not perfectly, not everywhere, not on the schedule we might wish, but truly in places and in ways worth witnessing. The rivers, it seems, remembered how to hold their banks. The willows remembered how to grow tall along the water. The beavers remembered how to build. And the valley remembered its oldest voice, the one it had carried for thousands of years before we fell silent it. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson in it, that the wild does not always need us to rebuild it, plank by plank. Sometimes it only needs us to step back, and to stop, and to open the gate. Thank you for spending this time with us. If these slow journeys into forgotten places and returning wild things are a comfort to you, you are always welcome to subscribe and to travel the seasons with us again.